Thank you very much for your introduction. It was suggested that I speak in English, so I hope you don't mind. I can switch to Arabic, but this is what was I told when I was asked to make the presentation. I'm going to restrict my talk on the fiscal side. Where we stand with regard to the fiscal situation in Lebanon. I'm going to talk about three areas: the current budget structure, where we stand now, the reform needed to be achieved to achieve targets in 2025. How are we going to move forward from now into the future, 2025 or earlier even, okay? I would like to discuss first the main features of both government revenues and government expenditure. If we just look at, I don't know if many of you had the chance to look or review the fiscal figures. If we look at the revenue structure in Lebanon, we find that the indirect taxes means taxes on goods and services. They are very high. I'll show you the rates, which is considered to be a regressive tax. So our reliance is very high on indirect taxes, whereas our dependence on direct taxes, on income taxes, is very low. There are many reasons for that. We may discuss it if we have time or in the question and answer session. Now, most countries, if you compare Lebanon to countries who have a similar level of income, we find that we have many, or the distortions in our revenue structure are very outstanding. Most countries have a better balance between taxes on income and taxes on goods and services. And it has to be clear to you, when we tax goods and services, the burden of the tax on the lower income groups is much higher than the burden of the tax on higher income groups. So a good part, relatively, the poorer segment of our population carries more of the tax burden than the wealthier part of the population. You may link it, if you want, there are many factors behind analyzing it, to the preferences of the political leadership in Lebanon. Does the political leadership prefer indirect taxes or direct taxes? Okay. Now, these are the numbers based on 2014-15. We see that the income tax is only 4% of GDP. You know, in most countries, it's 10 to 15%. Okay? So we have a total income, a total revenue, tax revenue, or total revenue of 22%. 16% of it comes from the tax revenue, and 6% comes from non-tax revenue. Actually, a good part of non-tax revenue, which is transfers from Alpha and Touch, are originally in the form of indirect taxes. They are mostly excises and value-added tax. So when we look at this structure, we see that income tax constitutes only 18% of the total, whereas indirect taxes like VAT and customs and excise taxes constitute 55%. As I said, most other countries have a more balanced structure. So to reform the tax structure, which this tax structure has many implications on the economy, on the impact on the poorer level of segment of the population. You know, a country cannot move forward if a significant part of the population has a low income, and that low income is kept for an extended period of time, because it could constitute a major production force and a major consumption force. Now, if we look at expenditure, Also, the structure of expenditure is very distorted. Now, we find that Lebanon has one of the lowest investment rates among its peer countries. I'll show you the numbers in a minute. It's less than 2% of GDP. Most countries have 10% and above. Countries like Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and others, and Japan, and Ireland, and many countries, and even Turkey and so on, who have progressed very fast, they dedicated large portion of their revenue, of their resources to investment. That's why in Lebanon, we have deficiency in almost all the sectors. The reason we have problems in the power sector is because we didn't invest enough in the power sector, and we did not invest properly in the power sector. Same applies to transportation, health, education, and many environment and so on. We find a major deficiency for a country that's the level of income of Lebanon. Lebanon has a per capita income which is equivalent to Cyprus. If you go to Cyprus, you see that all these problems that we have don't exist. They have power all the time, they manage their resources, they manage their, they have good waste management, they have good schools, good medical care, and so on. Okay. So if we look at these numbers, we find that we spend 28.5 of the budget, at 28.5% goes to expenditure, where we have a revenue of 22% of gross domestic product. Now, wages receive 9% of the 28.5%, but transfers and subsidies are almost 6%. Lebanon spends a large portion of its budget on transfers and subsidies. And the main receiver of these subsidies is the power sector. Also, another main feature of the subsidies that we have is that it is not targeted. We are not allocating subsidies to a poor segment of population. Most of our subsidies are widespread, and the wealthy segment population benefits from it, like in the electricity sector, as much as even more than the lower income groups. We have high interest payments because of the misguided fiscal policy that accumulated over the years. We have high debt, which is about $72 billion, and we have to service that debt, and we pay about $6 billion of interest payments per year to service that debt. So we can see that capital expenditure for the past 2 years, it's about less than 2%, 1.5%. We have treasury spending. These are allocations to municipalities. So we have a clear distortion in the structure of revenue and the structure of expenditure. Now, these distortions take time to correct because they have been built up and accumulated over so many years. We cannot correct them all of a sudden, and we cannot correct them without having a good plan that looks forward towards 2025 to reach a better result. Okay? So we have the budget. The result of the budget outcome is low. We have low revenues and high expenditure. In addition to the distortions in revenue and expenditure, we have high deficits, and the deficit in 1 year creates an addition to that. So the cumulative of deficits, large deficits from the 90s until today, have added up to $72 billion. Now, in some years, we applaud some good performance. For instance, in 2014, 2015, we had in the budget what we call primary surplus, meaning that if interest payments were excluded, the debt service was excluded, we had a surplus. But the surplus was coincidental. It was not policy planned because oil prices went down, and mainly the sum of government spending, especially subsidies to electricity, were cut in half. Now, the results of today are an accumulation of the policies that we have adopted in the past. As Minister Sharbil was saying, all of this is not the product of 1 year or one quarter, but all the policies that we had in the past. Our tax policies that we adopted, especially after the war, focused on basing taxation on goods and services rather than on income. And this is a major transformation. Actually, in countries, when they call for a referendum, if they want to make such an important shift by moving the tax base from spending on goods to a tax base on spending on income. And we can see that taxes on goods and services, they raise prices, they reduce disposable income, but you pay them even if you don't have an income. Where income tax, you pay it only when you generate income. So an unemployed person has to pay taxes on goods and services, although he's unemployed and doesn't have an income. Whereas income tax, you pay it when you have income. So the concept, there are extensive studies on the difference between the one and the other. My preference is to have a strong income tax base and less reliance on indirect or taxes on goods and services. We can have goods and services for different reasons, but for instance, we want to limit the consumption of certain products, including fuel and so on, because it has an impact on the balance of payments for waste management purposes, waste in resources. Okay? So we had a major change in our tax policy, including the introduction of VAT in 2002 at 10%. However, at the same time, we lowered our income taxes. So these distortions became magnified. Also, reforms were protracted. Part of the accumulation of the deficits and the debt because we didn't we started rebuilding the country before we reformed the tax policy and the tax bases. Now, what we need to do as we move forward to 2025, we need to rectify what we see today. We need to rectify the structure of revenues, and we need to rectify the structure of expenditure. So the revenues, we have to introduce a restructuring of the tax policy so that there is more dependence on income taxes. We also have to improve the management taxation because an important reason for the fact that we have a low income tax rate relative to GDP, as I said, 4%, is, as many of you know, we have in Lebanon extensive income tax evasion. We have also tax evasion in indirect taxes in paying value-added tax and other taxes. We have to also reduce tax exemptions because the tax policy in Lebanon is discretionary. We often simplify it or eliminate the tax in certain activity to please or in response to the interests of certain groups. And sometimes these leads to extensive.
دكتور منير عفوا نحن بعد باقي معنا مع حضرتك دقيقتين.
Okay, fine, that's good enough. So the tax reform has to take into consideration that we need to restructure our taxes to become more balanced, more weight to income taxes. On the expenditure reform, now the expenditure structure that we have high wages relative to other spending, and we have high subsidies and high interest payments. Now the interest payments on debt, it takes us a long period of time to restructure. It has to be linked to improve the fiscal performance. Now in the expenditure, the item that can easily be improved over a short period of time, it's transfers and subsidies, And the segment of the economy that receives the largest proportion of this is the power sector. The power sector can be reformed over a short period of time through independent power production. Most experts who have written on Lebanon, whether it's the World Bank or independent experts, have recommended that production be undertaken by the private sector, but through international bidding. It's true that this may bring in international companies, but it saves Lebanon money. We cannot continue with the production as we are going now. We can build 1,000 additional megawatts of power without financing it domestically. It will be financed by the private sector. Okay. Also, there are many other reforms that we can accomplish, especially in terms of other subsidies. We have substantial subsidies, close to $300 million a year, to organizations, to non-public institutions, and also we have a significant amount of subsidy that goes to interest payments, interest by providing certain industries lower interest rate than the market, but the allocation of these subsidies to the interest cost is not clear, and it's a burden in the economy and often induces unproductive investments in different sectors, including in restaurants that we see mushrooming every day. So these are the main points. The savings from all these sources, especially the power sector and subsidies, can be channeled to investment that will allow the economy to grow and create more jobs and more employment. Thank you very much.